Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back in time where the ancient world comes alive in the gentle glow of storytelling. Tonight, we travel to the banks of the mighty Nile, where one of humanity's greatest civilizations flourished amidst both splendor and hardship. As the modern world fades away, allow your mind to drift along those ancient waters, where life's contrasts were as stark as the boundary between fertile black soil and unyielding desert. This historical journey is designed to help you unwind, to let the rhythms of ancient life slow your thoughts and perhaps guide you toward peaceful slumber. There is something deeply calming about connecting with those who walked this earth thousands of years before us, sharing in their human experience across the vast expanse of time. I'm always curious to know where in our modern world you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling in for the night, or maybe enjoying a peaceful afternoon moment. Please share in the comments where you are and what time of day it is for you. It brings me such joy to see our community of history enthusiasts gathering from across the globe. If you find comfort in these historical journeys, consider subscribing so you won't miss future explorations into the fascinating lives of those who came before us. Each story is a doorway to another time, waiting to transport you away from modern concerns. Now, let us leave behind the hum of technology and the rush of contemporary life. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to be carried back over 4,000 years to the banks of the life-giving Nile, where two very different Egypts existed, side by side under the same burning sun. The morning star still hung in the pale dawn sky as Amenhotep, royal scribe and overseer of the granaries of Lower Egypt, stepped onto the polished limestone floor of his courtyard. The cool stone beneath his feet would be his last comfort before the merciless sun claimed the day. His servant Mequetre approached with a basin of water, head bowed in deference. "The boats have been arriving since before dawn, my lord," Mequetre said quietly. "The harbor master says there are already 17 waiting to be assessed." Amenhotep sighed as he washed his hands and face. The flood season had ended 2 months ago, and now came the endless procession of farmers bringing their portion of the harvest to the royal granaries. "Tell the scribes to prepare the accounting tablets," he instructed, reaching for the fine linen kilt his wife had laid out. "And have my chair and sunshade brought to the eastern courtyard. We will begin as soon as I have eaten." As he broke his morning bread, dipping it in herb-infused oil, Amenhotep mentally reviewed the quotas set by the vizier. This year's flood had been adequate but not abundant, and already he could feel the pressure building from both directions. The royal treasury demanding ever more grain for the pharaoh's ambitious building projects, and the farmers pleading for leniency as they struggled to feed their families after surrendering their portion to the state. By the time Amenhotep settled himself beneath the linen sunshade in the eastern courtyard, the day's heat was beginning to assert itself. Before him stretched a line of farmers, each with their bundles of accounting papyri and samples of grain. His 5 scribes sat cross-legged nearby, reed pens and palettes ready. "Begin," he commanded, straightening his back and adopting the impassive expression expected of a royal official. The first farmer approached, a thin man named Rahotep, whom Amenhotep recognized from previous seasons. "Great one, may you have the blessings of Hapi," the farmer began, using the traditional greeting invoking the god of the Nile flood. "I bring the portion from the fields of Nekeb." He presented his documentation, simple marks on papyrus made by the local tax assessor, along with a small sack of grain. Amenhotep nodded to his chief scribe, who took the papyrus while another examined the grain quality. "The yield appears lower than last season," Amenhotep observed, keeping his voice neutral. "Has disease affected your fields?" "No, great one," Rahotep replied, eyes fixed on the ground. "But the water did not reach the western section. We carried water in jars for weeks, but still many plants withered." His hands, cracked and calloused from endless labor, twisted nervously at the frayed edge of his simple kilt. This was the delicate moment that Amenhotep faced dozens of times each day, the space between duty and compassion. The royal decree was absolute. Each field had a quota based on its size, not on what it actually produced. Failure to meet that quota was considered an offense against Ma'at, the divine order, and ultimately against Pharaoh himself. Yet Amenhotep had seen enough failed floods to know that sometimes the gods themselves seemed to work against the farmers. "Show me the assessment map," he said to his scribe, who quickly produced a detailed papyrus showing Rahotep's fields. Amenhotep studied it carefully, then made a small mark in the corner. "The western section will be recorded as damaged land. Your quota is reduced by 1/8. It was a small mercy, less than the actual loss, but all he could justify to his superiors. "Next year, consider digging a deeper irrigation channel to the western edge." Relief washed over Rahotep's weathered face. "May Amun-Ra shine upon you, Great One," he said, bowing deeply before backing away. As the morning wore on, the heat intensified. Amenhotep's linen kilt clung to his skin despite the shade, and he sipped frequently from a copper cup of beer diluted with water. His scribes worked tirelessly, recording each transaction with meticulous precision. Any error could bring the vizier's displeasure, or worse, suggest corruption, a crime punishable by mutilation or death. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead, Amenhotep had processed more than 30 farmers. Some he knew by name, others were strangers, but all shared the same sun-darkened skin, calloused hands, and anxious expressions. Behind the official facade he maintained, Amenhotep felt the weight of their lives. His own father had risen from humble origins, and though Amenhotep had been raised in relative comfort, educated in the house of life and marked for administrative service from childhood, he had not forgotten the stories of hunger during poor flood years. A commotion at the courtyard entrance drew his attention. 2 royal guards escorted a well-dressed man toward Amenhotep's station. He recognized Senefer, an emissary from the vizier's office, and felt a knot form in his stomach. Unscheduled visits from the central administration rarely brought good news. "Health and life to you, Amenhotep," Senefer said with minimal courtesy. "I bring word from the divine house. The preparations for the said festival require additional grain stores. Your district's contribution will increase by 1/5, effective immediately." The farmers waiting in line stirred uneasily, having overheard the pronouncement. Amenhotep kept his face carefully neutral, though his mind raced. "The harvest is already allocated according to the spring decree," he said carefully. "Many farmers have already made their contributions based on those figures." Senefer's smile did not reach his eyes. "Then those who remain will need to provide more, won't they? The Pharaoh's jubilee cannot be celebrated with empty granaries. I'm certain a capable administrator such as yourself can find a solution that satisfies the divine will." The threat beneath the compliment was unmistakable. After Senefer departed, Amenhotep sat in silence for a long moment. The remaining farmers watched him with undisguised fear. To meet the new quota, he would need to extract significantly more grain from each of them, grain they had counted on to feed their families through the coming year. "We will continue," he finally said to his scribes. "Record everything as before." He would find another solution. Perhaps reassess the temple lands, which were often underreported, or draw from his own emergency reserves. The alternative was watching children starve in the coming months. As the afternoon progressed, Amenhotep felt increasingly trapped between the unyielding demands of the state and the desperate reality of those who actually produced Egypt's wealth. By the time the last farmer departed, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard. His back ached from sitting all day, and his mind was weary from the constant calculations and negotiations. "The total collection is recorded, my lord," his chief scribe reported, presenting the day's tally on a fresh papyrus. "Even before the new quota, we are 3% below the expected amount." Amenhotep nodded grimly. "Prepare a full accounting for my review tonight. I will make adjustments before the report goes to Memphis." He rose stiffly, dismissing his staff with a gesture. As he walked back to his private quarters, Amenhotep passed the high walls that separated the administrative compound from the farmer's village beyond. The contrast could not have been more stark. His world of painted walls, imported furniture, and educated conversation versus their mud brick hovels, shared with animals and plagued by disease. Yet both worlds depended entirely on the same fickle river and its annual gift of water and fertile silt. His wife waited in their courtyard, supervising the evening meal preparation. "You look troubled," she observed, dismissing the servants with a subtle gesture. "Was it a difficult collection?" "The vizier has increased our quota," Amenhotep replied, accepting a cup of wine, "for the said festival, as if the farmers can produce grain from empty fields through sheer loyalty to Pharaoh." She touched his arm gently. "You will find a way. You always do." Amenhotep nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Tomorrow would bring more farmers, more desperate faces, more impossible choices between duty and humanity. And somewhere far to the south, the next flood was already forming, its bounty or scarcity already determined by gods who seemed increasingly indifferent to the prayers of either officials or farmers in the two Egypts that existed side by side along the eternal Nile. The dawn broke over the eastern cliffs, painting the quarry in harsh light that revealed what darkness had mercifully hidden. Hundreds of men scattered across the limestone face, their bodies already glistening with sweat, though the day's worst heat remained hours away. Senbi adjusted his grip on the copper chisel, feeling the familiar calluses that had formed over the past 3 years since he had joined the quarry workers at Tura. He was 20 summers old now, the same age his father had been when he first came to these quarries, though his father had lasted 16 more years before a collapsing stone had crushed his chest, leaving Senbi to continue the family's service to the pharaoh. "Mind your line, Senbi," called Ipuwer, the overseer who had worked alongside Senbi's father for many years. "Remember what I taught you. Follow the natural seam and let the stone speak to you." The older man's skin was leathery from decades under the merciless sun, his back permanently curved from bending over stone. Senbi nodded and returned to his work, carefully tapping along the faint line that would, with proper skill and the blessing of the gods, allow them to separate a massive block from the quarry face without shattering it. Around him, the rhythmic sounds of the quarry formed a harsh melody, the tap-tap-tap of copper chisels against stone, the grunts of men leveraging wooden beams to move cut blocks, the occasional shout of warning or pain, and the constant scrape of dolerite pounding stones used to shape the rough cuts. Senbi paused to wipe sweat from his eyes with a forearm equally dusty, leaving a smear of white limestone powder across his face. His shoulders ached from yesterday's labor, and the cut on his left palm had reopened, leaving small bloodstains on the pale stone. Such marks were common enough that the masons downstream in the construction process knew to turn those faces inward, hidden for eternity within the monuments they built. The quarry at Tura had been worked for generations, providing the fine white limestone that would face the great pyramids and temples. Unlike the rougher core stones that came from Giza itself, these facing stones needed to be perfect, smooth, unmarked, worthy of the gods and the divine pharaoh. The work demanded precision that seemed impossible given the primitive tools and broken bodies tasked with the job. Senbi had seen men beaten for allowing a stone to crack along the wrong line, wasting months of labor and precious material. He had also seen men crushed when stone blocks weighing more than 20 oxen shifted unexpectedly during extraction or loading. By midday, when the sun stood directly overhead, offering no shadow for relief, the workers paused briefly to drink from water skins and chew on dried bread and onions. Senbi sat with his back against a cut block, feeling the heat radiating from both the stone and the sky. "They say this pyramid will be the greatest ever built," said Hori, a worker perhaps 5 years older than Senbi, his left leg noticeably shorter than his right from a badly healed break years earlier. Taller than any before it, with passages that align with the stars themselves. "So they always say," replied Senbi, taking a careful sip of water, rationing it to last through the afternoon. "My father heard the same about the last one, and his father before him. The pharaohs change, but the weight of the stones remains the same." He glanced toward the river, where they could just make out the massive wooden sledges being prepared to transport the finished blocks. The journey from quarry to construction site was often more dangerous than the cutting itself, with men crushed between sledges or drowned when rafts overturned in the Nile's currents. The respite ended too quickly as the overseer's wooden clapper signaled the return to work. Senbi rose stiffly, feeling the familiar pain in his lower back that never truly subsided anymore. He was young still, but already he could feel his body breaking down, becoming like the worn tools they discarded when they grew too blunt for use. As he positioned himself again before his section of stone, he whispered a quick prayer to Ptah, patron of craftsmen, asking for steady hands and strong stone. The gods rarely seemed to answer such prayers, but the ritual itself provided comfort. Miles away, in a shaded pavilion overlooking the great construction site at Giza, Hemiunu unrolled a papyrus scroll and studied the calculations marked in careful hieratic script. As the overseer of all the king's works and nephew to Pharaoh Khufu himself, Hemiunu carried the immense responsibility of transforming divine vision into earthly reality. He was a man of two worlds, noble enough to walk in the pharaoh's shadow, yet practical enough to understand the mechanics of moving stone blocks weighing more than 50 men. "The angle must be precise," he explained to the junior architects gathered around him, pointing to the markings on the papyrus. "If we err by even the width of a finger at the base, the apex will be off by the height of a man. The pharaoh's passage to the stars must be perfect." His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades mastering his craft, though the pressure of his position had left deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Unlike the workers who toiled with their bodies, Hemiunu's burden was carried in his mind. The constant calculations, adjustments, and decisions that would determine whether Khufu's Great Pyramid would stand for eternity or collapse in humiliating failure. A messenger approached, bowing low before speaking. "Master Hemiunu, the shipment from Tura is delayed. A sledge broke on the causeway, and 3 workers were crushed. The foreman requests more men to clear the path and continue transport." Hemiunu's expression remained unchanged, though a muscle tightened in his jaw. Such reports came daily: broken equipment, injured workers, unexpected delays. Each one represented not just a logistical problem, but human suffering that he, as overseer, ultimately authorized in service to the greater purpose. "Send 30 men from the eastern work crew," he replied after a moment's calculation, "and inform the physicians to prepare for the injured." As the messenger departed, Hemiunu turned back to his plans, his finger tracing the internal chambers where the pharaoh's body would eventually rest. The divine perfection of these designs contrasted sharply with the messy, bloody reality of their execution. Hemiunu understood this contradiction better than most. How the immortal monuments that would carry Khufu's name through eternity were built on the broken backs of men whose names would be forgotten before their bodies were even cold. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Hemiunu walked the construction site, inspecting the day's progress. Workers scrambled to appear diligent in his presence, though their exhaustion was evident in slumped shoulders and trembling limbs. The massive blocks from Tura were being fitted with remarkable precision, gaps between them so tight that a reed could not be inserted. This perfection came at tremendous cost, not just in materials and time, but in human suffering. Near the northern face of the growing pyramid, Hemiunu paused to observe the physicians at work in a small treatment area. Here, the physical price of monument building was most evident. A young worker lay on a reed mat, his leg grotesquely angled where a rolling stone had shattered the bone. Two physicians worked methodically, one holding the limb steady while the other prepared to set the brake. Around them, other injured workers waited their turn, some with crushed fingers, others with deep cuts or burns from rope friction. The chief physician, Imhotep, nodded respectfully to Hemiunu as he approached. Unlike many of his predecessors who claimed magical healing powers, Imhotep was known for his practical approach to medicine, developed through years of treating construction injuries. "We lose fewer men than in your father's time," Imhotep remarked, washing his hands in a bowl of water infused with natron. "The splinting techniques we developed for the quarry workers have saved many limbs that would have been lost before." Hemiunu watched as the physicians expertly manipulated the broken leg, aligning the bones before applying a mixture of linen bandages soaked in resin and gum. Over this, they fitted carefully carved wooden splints, binding everything tightly with more linen. "He will walk again?" Hemiunu asked, knowing that a crippled worker often meant a family condemned to poverty. "If infection doesn't take him, yes," Imhotep replied. "We've learned that keeping the break immobile for 50 days allows the bone to knit properly. The knowledge came at a high price, hundreds of similar breaks before we understood the proper treatment." He gestured to several workers, mixing medications nearby. "We've also improved our pain remedies. The poppy extract mixed with beer helps them endure the setting of the bones." Egyptian medicine had advanced significantly through the grim laboratory of construction accidents. Physicians now categorized injuries with remarkable precision, distinguishing between breaks that could be treated and those that meant certain death, between wounds that required stitching and those best left to drain. Specialized tools had been developed for removing stone fragments from flesh, for drilling small holes to relieve pressure in skull injuries, for setting different types of fractures. As the sun touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the construction site, work finally ceased for the day. Senbi and his fellow quarry workers set aside their tools and made their way to the simple reed shelters that served as their homes while on rotation at the quarry. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, and fresh cuts on his hands stung as he washed them in a communal water basin. Around him, men compared injuries, shared meager rations, and occasionally laughed despite their circumstances, finding humanity in shared suffering. In his more elaborate quarters near the pyramid site, Hemiunu sat alone with his calculations and a cup of wine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another day of balancing the pharaoh's divine mandate against the limitations of human flesh and primitive technology. He thought briefly of the workers whose bodies would break to bring his designs to life, then pushed the thought aside. The monuments would stand for eternity, he reminded himself. The suffering was temporary, but the glory of Egypt would endure forever. Still, as he closed his eyes to rest, it was not the perfect angles of his pyramid that he saw, but the faces of men straining against stone, their bodies sacrificed for a vision they would never fully comprehend, but faithfully brought into being with their blood and bone. The sun had barely risen over the eastern horizon when Neferet emerged from her modest mud-brick home, her youngest child balanced on her hip. Unlike previous mornings when worry had etched deep lines across her face, today she walked with purpose toward her sister, Hanutzen's dwelling, just 3 homes away. The Nile's flood had come late and lower than expected, leaving their family's plot with poor soil and meager prospects for the season ahead. But they would survive. They always did, because no Egyptian family stood truly alone. "Sister," Neferet called softly, as she approached the doorway covered by a simple reed mat. "I've brought the little one. May the gods bless you for watching him while I help Rahotep in the fields." Hanutzen appeared, her own children already busy grinding grain in the corner of the single-room dwelling. The sisters exchanged no words about the arrangement. None were needed. When Hanutzen's husband had been conscripted for the pharaoh's building projects 2 seasons prior, Neferet and Rahotep had shared their food without hesitation. Now, with their own hardship looming, the favor was returned without question. Throughout the settlements that dotted the fertile ribbon of land along the Nile, similar scenes unfolded each day. Extended families, not just parents and children, but networks of siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, formed intricate webs of mutual support that made survival possible when individual households might otherwise collapse under misfortune's weight. In a world where a single illness could devastate a family's ability to work their land or meet the tax collector's demands, these bonds meant everything. In the village center, old Kagemni sat beneath the shade of a sycamore fig tree, his gnarled hands still surprisingly nimble as they worked a piece of linen. Though his eyes had clouded with age, the children gathered around him knew he could still see enough to catch them misbehaving. "When I was a boy," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades, "the pharaoh Sneferu commanded the building of the bent pyramid at Dashur. My grandfather was taken to haul stone, just as some of your fathers have been." The children leaned closer, familiar with the story, but eager to hear it again. 6 seasons he labored, and when he returned, his back was bent like the pyramid itself. The old man chuckled, though the tale was more truth than jest. "But grandfather," asked a small boy whose father had been gone for nearly a year, "did he come home?" Kagemni nodded solemnly. "Yes, child. Not all do. But he returned to his family. And while he was gone, his brothers ensured his wife and children had bread, just as your uncles now watch over your mother." The boy nodded, finding comfort in the ancient pattern of family obligation that had sustained their people through countless generations. When illness struck, these bonds proved even more vital. In a modest home near the village edge, Marisank lay on a reed mat, her body burning with fever as her mother-in-law pressed cool, damp cloths to her forehead. Outside, her husband's brothers worked their brothers' fields alongside their own, ensuring the family's crops would not fail during her sickness. Their wives took turns bringing food and caring for Marisank's children, incorporating them seamlessly into their own daily routines of cooking, cleaning, and household crafts. "The physician says the fever may break tomorrow," the mother-in-law told her son when he returned from the fields, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion from working double his usual hours. "Your brothers have promised to help again tomorrow." The man nodded gratefully, too tired for words. In this moment, as in countless others throughout Egypt's long history, the extended family proved to be not merely a social arrangement, but a survival strategy, perhaps the most effective one ordinary Egyptians possessed. Even in times of relative plenty, when the Nile's flood came generously and the granaries stood full, life remained precarious for most Egyptians. Yet amidst the constant labor and uncertainty, they found remarkable ways to experience joy. As the season of Akhet ended and the waters receded fully from the land, villages throughout Egypt prepared for the festival of Opet, one of many celebrations that punctuated the agricultural calendar and provided precious respite from daily toil. In Thebes, the preparations were particularly elaborate as the festival approached. Families cleaned their homes thoroughly and prepared special foods, setting aside a portion of their precious stores for feasting. Children ran excitedly through the narrow pathways between houses, practicing songs they would sing during the processions. Even Amenhotep, the tax collector who had struggled with his conscience over the increased grain quotas, found his spirits lifting as he watched workers decorating the processional route with flowers and colorful banners. "Father! Father!" His youngest daughter tugged at his hand, her eyes bright with excitement. "Will we see the god's boat today?" Amenhotep smiled down at her, momentarily setting aside his worries about meeting the vizier's impossible demands. "Yes, little one. The god Amun will journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple, and we will follow in the procession." He lifted her onto his shoulders so she could see over the growing crowd. "Listen, the musicians are beginning." The sound of sistrum rattles, drums, and flutes filled the air as the procession began to form. Priests emerged from the temple complex, carrying the sacred bark of Amun on their shoulders, its gold overlay catching the sunlight in brilliant flashes. The crowd erupted in cheers and songs, the collective joy palpable as everyday Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and officials alike, joined together in celebration. For these precious hours, the hierarchies and hardships of daily life seemed to dissolve in the face of shared devotion and festivity. In villages far from the splendor of Thebes, celebrations took simpler forms but held no less meaning. As evening fell across the land, families gathered in courtyards and open spaces, sharing meals that, while humble, contained special treats reserved for festive occasions. Children played senet, a board game beloved throughout Egyptian society, while adults engaged in friendly competitions of strength or skill. Musicians played harps, pipes, and drums as young men and women danced, their movements telling stories of the gods, or simply expressing the joy of being alive. An old farmer named Ptahhotep watched his grandchildren play, a cup of beer, brewed stronger than usual for the festival, warming his hand, though his back ached from decades of bending over irrigation channels and his hands were permanently calloused from the hoe. In this moment he felt a contentment that transcended his physical discomfort. "The gods have blessed me," he murmured to his wife of 40 years, who sat beside him, grinding her teeth on bread that had grown too hard for his worn-down molars to manage. She nodded, understanding that despite all their hardships, these moments of togetherness were treasures beyond measure. Even in ordinary days, Egyptians found small pleasures that made life bearable. Children fashioned dolls from scraps of linen and bits of clay, while adults enjoyed simple board games after the day's work was done. Music was not reserved solely for festivals. Mothers sang to their children while working, men chanted rhythmically to coordinate their efforts when moving heavy objects, and even solitary craftsmen often hummed or sang to pass the hours of detailed work. For many Egyptians, however, the greatest source of meaning and comfort lay not in the present world, but in their conception of what lay beyond it. The belief in an afterlife, not as a distant heaven, but as a continuation of earthly existence in perfected form, gave purpose to suffering and transformed their relationship with death itself. Far from being a preoccupation only of the elite, who could afford elaborate tombs and mummification, the afterlife held profound importance for ordinary Egyptians as well. In a modest workshop on the village outskirts, an elderly carpenter named Senenut carefully shaped a small wooden figurine. His hands, though gnarled with age, moved with practiced precision as he carved the features of a man carrying farming tools. "This Ushabti will work in your place in the field of reeds," he explained to his grandson, who watched intently. "When the gods call for labor in the afterlife, this figure will answer, 'I am here,' in your father's stead, so his spirit may rest." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding even at his young age the importance of proper preparation for the journey beyond death. Nearby, a woman named Taweret prepared a simple meal of bread, beer, and dried fish. Instead of serving it to her family, however, she carried it to a small shrine at the back of their home where a crude stela bore the names of her parents. "Eat, mother and father," she whispered as she set down the offerings. "May you never hunger in the realm of Osiris." Though she could not afford the elaborate funerary preparations of the noble classes, these regular offerings maintained the connection between the living and the dead, ensuring her parents' continued existence in the afterlife. For ordinary Egyptians, death was not an end, but a transition, one that required careful preparation throughout life. Families saved for years to afford even modest burial goods, prioritizing items believed necessary for the journey to the afterlife over comforts in the present world. Simple amulets, basic coffins, and small collections of everyday objects accompanied even the poorest Egyptians to their graves, testifying to the universal belief that life continued beyond death's threshold. Yet this focus on the afterlife did not mean Egyptians neglected to find joy in their earthly existence. Rather, their belief system encouraged them to embrace life fully while acknowledging its temporary nature. "Live well today," went a common saying, "for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it." This dual perspective, finding pleasure in the present while preparing for eternity, created a unique balance that helped ordinary Egyptians endure hardships that might otherwise have seemed unbearable. As the festival night deepened, the celebrations gradually quieted. Families returned to their homes, children fell asleep still clutching toys or treats, and adults spoke in hushed tones about the day's events. Tomorrow would bring a return to labor in the fields, workshops, and construction sites. The tax collector would still demand his due, the sun would still beat down mercilessly, and bodies would still ache from endless toil.